Hello everyone, Stuckuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And also, on that note, welcome back to the 4th episode of I Watched It So That You Didn't Have To, with the 4th episode of Queen Cleopatra on Netflix. It's the end of this 4-part miniseries, and in the end, I do have some final thoughts, but we will get to that here at the end. It's been an interesting journey, to say the least, going in through all these different episodes, and I really do love and appreciate all the support that you guys have shown. If you could, from the very beginning, like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help the video, and it helps my channel. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. It is the 4th episode, and it is the end. It is the end of Cleopatra. It's the end of all of this drama, and drama really is what this thing is filled with. I've commented it before many times, but the sheer amount of melodrama that exists in this series, it very is Netflix-esque. The sexy scenes, the standoffish characters, the big bold moves. It's a very Netflix-esque show. But anyway, things start over here in Alexandria. Mark Antony and Cleopatra are obviously having to prepare for the fact that Octavian is now bearing down upon them after the Battle of Actium. And again, there's this whole line and sequence in here about Cleopatra having received an offer from Octavian to spare her life if she killed Mark Antony. But I asked about that last time in the comments because I have seen nothing for it. And none of you all could tell me anything either in the comment section. I don't know where it is that they are getting this from. It just seems to be something that for dramatic flair is added into the story for Netflix to tell, perhaps for people who don't already know the story of Cleopatra, to give them some kind of hope of, or potentially foreshadowing of something to come. There's nothing inherently wrong with all of these scenes here in the beginning. It's just very dramatic. Here it's talking about the way that she had to send off all of her children in order to make sure that her dynasty would survive. All is correct, but simultaneously, again, it's dramatic. To be fair, I guess if you are sending off your children, that is going to be something that is going to be very dramatic and traumatizing, so it's fair. But she has sent them away in order to make sure that they can try and live on while she herself will continue to fight and hopefully for her win. Which brings us to this weird line as they're preparing for the fight where it says that Cleopatra was a diplomat first and a strategist second. And it confuses me as to why it continuously keeps on bringing up these things where it depicts Cleopatra as a fighter and a warrior. Now it's not doing it nearly to the same degree, but it will at the end. There's a really cringy scene that you're going to see in this. But it's talking about, of course, how she's being a diplomat and how good she is at all this and how she's a strategist second. And I would think, yes, of course, she is a strategist second because she's not a warrior. She never has been a warrior or a fighter, as much as Netflix has been trying to depict her as one the entire time. And then, oh my God, the conversations here that it just has with Mark Antony. Mark Antony is so incredibly whiny. It's so annoying. Here it is throughout this entire thing of depicting Cleopatra as this really strong, powerful, confident woman, which she was. She absolutely was. But it keeps on dichotomizing that with this really weak, spineless, whiny Mark Antony. With this whole sequence about like him thinking that, oh, possibly Cleopatra is going to end up betraying him and killing him to sacrifice him for her children and all that. It has this whole conversation between them about this offer that is brought up. But again, we see no proof of this offer. So this whole interaction, everything that this is based off of, which just compounds his mood even further, seems to just be made up. Also, leather frickin' armor. I have to. Leather frickin' armor. Everything moves on. They prepare for the fight. More soldiers pop into field. And what do we see? Leather frickin' armor again. It's so dumb. It's so dumb. It looks so bad. It looks so bad. And of course, this scene then leads into Mark Antony going forward, assaulting the messenger that apparently brought this message from Octavian about having Mark Antony killed in the first place. And I don't get it. I don't get it. If this whole thing for the messenger and the interaction was made up in the first place regarding the offer to Cleopatra, then what is this depiction here with Mark Antony going and assaulting him? Mark Antony seems to be a bit of a loose cannon. Yeah, the way that he's being depicted in here really does show that, apparently. And we move on. Once again, Octavian standing off in the desert looking broodingly over something. We don't really know. This has used the same shot like 20 different times already in this show. They keep on reusing it again and again and again, and it's just showing him as some brooding far-off villain about to take everything. His soldiers are marching in, again wearing shitty leather armor, which then confuses me because literally the next shot, not 2 seconds later, it then flips over to another shot of those same soldiers wearing then metal. Like Netflix, you're not using any consistency with any of these shots here. You show these soldiers marching in armor, and then in the exact same shot where you're showing them marching side by side, A, they're much closer together now and there's a lot more of them, so it doesn't make sense. And then B, metal. This is the Lorca. This is the Lorca Hamada right here. This is the chainmail-like substance, right? And then, of course, you have the Lorca Manica, the armor, all metal, only to then immediately switch back to leather. Like, you're splicing together shots from different things here that it doesn't make sense. I'm so confused. Anyway, they talk about the losses, how a bunch of soldiers ended up defecting from Mark Antony's side over to Octavian. And then they talk about Octavian's goals for Egypt and how he wants to take everything over and incorporate it into the empire, and how Egypt is very, very wealthy in terms of its material wealth, and that Octavian wants to seize this wealth in order to pay his troops, which he does. He does actually want to seize this. It's one of the things that he needs in order to be able to provide for the bonuses and the things for his soldiers. This is true. But they're framing it in like, oh, Rome doesn't care if it impoverishes Egypt. Like, what do you mean caring about impoverishing Egypt? No one is going to care if they impoverish another state at this time. Egypt is not the main character on the world stage of this happy-go-lucky place that everyone can live in peace and harmony in. It's another empire with its own soldiers and system of taxation and abuse and everything that exists in it. But they frame it in such a way of like Rome as this big greedy empire that wants to take it over and impoverish it and suck out all the wealth, as though they're not trying to take it over to manage it, much in the exact same way that Egypt wanted to take over and manage other territories. This is so unnecessary and just framing Rome as some kind of villain when this is the norm. This is what all the empires and everyone was doing at this time. Anyway, it talks about how Octavian goes over land, he secures all these different alliances, making sure that no one can threaten him against his rear. And then it talks about the propaganda campaign that he was waging against Cleopatra and how Octavian is framing this entire thing against Cleopatra, which is true, but then it's bringing up all these different things about showing how she's being depicted as this great seductress that is ruining Rome, that was destroying Roman men. And like, oh, so even though Mark Antony was the one who was unfaithful to his sister, Cleopatra is being framed as the great seductress. Yes, you already said that in the previous episode. And as I said in the previous episode, yes, because she was. Here is the issue. These things are not mutually exclusive. Cleopatra was a great leader. She was a great seductress. She was someone who actively was using men in order to further her own position, in order to shore up her power and position. Netflix, you yourself covered that multiple times, as I said in the previous episode, and now you act baffled, shocked, and so weirded out like, oh, and they're just framing her as this one who's seducing people. Yeah, because she was. There's nothing inherently wrong with that here. It's a political power move that she's trying to use. You actively then turn around and say that how they're framing her, oh, it's misogynistic and xenophobic. Like, Netflix, are you serious? You're talking about a situation from over 2,000 years ago, and you want to say with empire building that it's xenophobic and misogynistic how they're framing this. We're talking about the building of an empire. Everything is xenophobic because it's an enemy. It's not Rome. Therefore, it must be conquered. And the whole thing about misogyny, yeah, Rome specifically did look down upon a woman being in charge, but she was simultaneously very powerful. But them framing her as a seductress is not misogyny. That is accurate. It's just done in a very unflattering light in light of the Roman public. This whole sequence is so unnecessary and weird how it's impressing upon things with the modern values rather than just telling the story of what happened. So anyway, while all this is going on, Octavian is again preparing in Alexandria. Cleopatra and Mark Antony are going and having a banquet in order to kind of shore up their own political position and show the world that they're not really concerned. It's like it's a show of force and of bravery during this time when, of course, they get messages that people are starting to betray them still. But this entire setup where they're talking about purposefully depicting Mark Antony as a Eastern king is in itself weird because it's just cementing the propaganda that they were talking about earlier in this episode and the previous one, where everyone was becoming concerned that Mark Antony was being set up as a Eastern king. And now they're doing that on purpose and being like, oh yeah, no, this is just how it is. Anyway, Cleopatra's giving a speech. We don't know the circumstances of what was going on during this event. We don't know any of this detail, but of course it's put in for the reenactment as they're just going to talk about it. It goes into battle the next day as they're all preparing, again, leather frickin' armor, which is then followed by easily the worst choreography that I have ever seen in any of these. I mean, just look at this for a second. Look at this for a second. This scene of like Mark Antony moving around like a madman, coupled with all these soldiers just spread out over this field and area that is just going and like pushing against each other and wildly swinging. What is all this? What is this crap? All of them in leather armor. This guy is just standing over here. He's not even doing anything. He's just like, I'm just here for the free food that is served at the after party. I don't know. God, this whole thing is just so dumb and weird. They talk about the battle, how they're lacking in supplies and force, how things are not going well for them. Cleopatra is a lover, not a fighter, Shelley says. Well, then why has she been depicted as a fighter for pretty much this entire series? This whole sequence. God, this whole sequence right here, Mark Antony, it shows him pulling out his dagger in like some bullshit Hollywood thing here. The Pugio, like this is not a thing that would penetrate. Like what the fuck is this? What is this scene of having Mark Antony throw his dagger dramatically? Anyway, the battle ends. Easily one of the worst things that I think that I have seen in this entire thing. And Mark Antony comes marching back to see Cleopatra, reports that they did win the battle, but that the enemy's troops are just simply too great. It talks about the techniques that they're trying to do in order to preserve their status, trying to encourage people to flip over to the other side. And then during this, you see multiple scenes of flipping off to some other kind of scene. And I was curious about this because I was wondering why the hell nothing seemed to match in the Netflix documentary in the first place. Like why all these mismatched scenes of soldiers and people where it seems to flip to a different style entirely. And we did kind of figure out the reason, sort of. At least you all in the comments did let me know. So for anyone who's confused, when you see all these different scenes of things like this is not from Netflix's Cleopatra. They keep on pulling up old footage of like old Roman movies and documentaries and stuff from like what, the 90s or something, and then putting it in here. So they're splicing together scenes from other series to add to their own, probably to save on costume budget or something, which is funny because the stuff that they had way back then when this was made is significantly better than the shit that they're using now. There's such a huge difference in quality with those scenes, because then it goes right back to them fighting and it's just so bad. So it talks about Octavian launching his attack, how it doesn't go well, his fleet ends up defecting, Alexandria is laid siege to, and Octavian's forces are moving in, and the people inside begin to panic. Egyptian troops have defected. Cleopatra is just standing there like, oh God, what the hell is going on? What do you mean I'm losing? What do you mean I'm losing? There isn't much that I can really say about these scenes at this point because it's pretty much just trying to describe the sequence of events as it was occurring over the course of the battle. But once again, with Netflix, it goes in here and with a bunch of different close-up shots of Cleopatra and dramatic pans, it's then putting in more statements of like, Cleopatra is probably feeling defiant at this point. We imagine this. More probablys, more reimagines, more everything, because again, they're applying feeling to this scene that we don't know exactly what was going on or what this person was feeling, but they're giving their all 2 cents about what it is that they think about it. They talk about how she just wants to be able to successfully pass it on to one of her children, at least to try and preserve her dynastic throne. It then moves on to Cleopatra going to her mausoleum where she's gathered all of her treasure. Here she's threatening to burn it to the ground so that way Octavian wouldn't be able to pay his troops to kind of preserve it. Mark Antony ends up showing up there after having attempted to off himself and not really succeeded at that time, but of course he would succumb to his wounds later as we talked about. So he ends up getting hauled up through a window. All good information that they're putting in here talking about the sequence of events. It's dramatic, but to be fair, we're talking about a final stand and suicide, basically. So of course, yeah, there is going to be a bit of drama here. It does make sense. Mark Antony and Cleopatra there together, Mark Antony dying in her arms. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of these scenes. Like, there's not really much for me to point out here, except until the scene where it talks about how the Romans had to break in through the roof in order to go and see them, and Cleopatra is standing there defiantly with a torch, not letting them near in this big final standoffish moment. And so a soldier is told like, oh, to go and get her. So he does. And then it shows a scene of her like dramatically hitting him in the face with this torch to burn him, declaring that she is a god and that no one is going to touch her. Except what happens immediately after is they move forward and capture her anyway, and she's still taken. And I don't get it. There's no reason to have done any of that because I don't see any record of her actually having fought her captors. It's just another scene that is put in there to kind of like show her up as this big, powerful fighter again when she couldn't do anything there in the end. No one really could do anything at the end. She had lost. It was over. This next scene, though, this is the one that really does bother me. Out of this entire sequence, this is probably the worst one, and it's Cleopatra meeting Octavian for the first time, and the dialogue that they put into it is simply awful, because it depicts Octavian taunting her, calling her a witch, doing all these different things, mocking her as an African queen, calling her children bastard half-breeds, doing all these different things in here with really cringy bad lines. Insulting her beauty, having her have a smiling one-up comeback where she calls him short. Netflix, what is the point in any of this? I see nothing from any source that verifies them taunting each other or mocking each other the entire time that this is happening. The only reason any of this is put in is because it's showing Octavian, from the language that they are using, as being this pompous, serial killer-like white guy who is looking down upon this strong, independent African queen. And if my phrasing of those words sounds weird, that is the language that they're using. He's deriding her as a African queen, the thing that Netflix has been pushing this entire time. He's calling her children half-breeds and her a witch. He's doing all these things in the show that it's showing this right here that is framing him in the worst light possible and Cleopatra as this big victim. The entire sequence is so dramatic and cringy, and it's terrible framing because it's villainizing people in what is a grand drama. But of course, she doesn't give him the reaction that he wants, so Netflix has to depict Octavian as this, like, screaming man-child. And then it moves on to the sequence of events of Cleopatra having been captured there in her royal apartments. She sends off a letter, and then she and all of her advisors take poison, offing themselves, and, you know, that's the end of Cleopatra. That's the end of this here. It draws it out for their whole sequence showing how they could have possibly done it, because, again, Netflix does do a proper job of addressing the fact that we don't know how it is that Cleopatra actually died. The common story of that she utilized an asp or a cobra to, you know, to off herself, we have no proof of. That's just the story as it's commonly told. So all this is true, and then it discusses how Octavian would have then been figuring out what to do with the bodies because he couldn't bring them back to Rome now at this point, and that we do not know where Cleopatra is buried, and that the Roman tradition was cremation, so that's probably what ended up happening. She might not have been buried whatsoever. At this point, it's speculation, but it's reasonable speculation based off a mystery that we ourselves still do not know to this day. It's understandable. But then it talks about the fate of Egypt afterwards, and how, okay, Egypt gets taken over by Rome. Rome doesn't care that it's impoverishing Egypt. It becomes the grain basket of Rome, which that part is true. It does become the bread basket that would supply Rome with a lot of its grain that it would use to fuel its cities. And it says Rome would not have been able to go on to be the military power that it was without Egypt. And this is not true, but also kind of true, because again, remember, it did supercharge Rome's industry and its population and its people. It was able to help fuel the development of its cities. And Egypt would actually become one of the most valuable provinces in the empire, especially through trade, because any of the trade that would happen through India, all that would be taxed heavily out of Egypt. So this is true, but Rome still would have gone on to be a military power. It just wouldn't have the level of opulence and wealth that it would later. But even then, the bad part is it's talking about how in doing so that it's extracting this wealth from Egypt, that it's tapping into the Bank of Egypt, that it's impoverishing it, as though it's taking everything over and destroying it, which is not the case. It's the end of an independent Egypt, yes, but simultaneously, Rome is taking over as new management, much in the same way as Egypt had taken over other territories and managed those. Again, Netflix does a somewhat decent job talking about the characters of people, but anytime they mention anything to do with geopolitics, and the way that they frame these things is like good guys and bad guys, and it's so weird and dumb. And then it outright says that Octavian has the Senate declare him as emperor. No, Octavian never, ever declared himself to be emperor. Like, this is just outright false. We consider Octavian to have been the first emperor of Rome. Yes, this is the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. But Octavian was never actually a Roman emperor, even if we consider him to be. He was the first citizen of Rome. He was the one who was calling all the shots, yes, but he was never emperor, and he did not have himself declared as emperor. That doesn't make any sense. Why frame this in such a way when that transition, the transition between Republic and Empire, him not declaring himself to be emperor was such a key part of his strategy, because it meant that he was still keeping the traditions of the old Republic alive. It allowed for that death to occur because it wasn't as sudden of a shock to the Roman system. This is just false Netflix. But okay, it talks about how them living on, the children being alive and what happens to them afterwards, her son Caesarion getting killed. And there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these necessarily. This is all okay. It even talks about how the really interesting detail, and I am glad that they actually put this in, talking about her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, and what ends up happening with her, how she herself goes on to be another queen in Mauritania. And I do appreciate the little detail that they put here in the end. That part is kind of nice. But then it goes and finishes things off at the end by having this sequence of like Cleopatra power moves and statements and things that she said. There is no Rome without Egypt. I am a god. All this other stuff that's like saying this in the background, like some ethereal ghost of her. And it's just odd. It's weird because after all of these scenes that we have seen, all of these made up lines that Netflix has put into the show, it then finishes everything off with our scene from Shelley, where she has this whole line of things about how she didn't want to talk about telling the story of Cleopatra, but that for years she was having these dreams where a shadowy figure was telling her that she had to tell her story and that was Cleopatra, which is such a weird, dumb thing. But the sequence is so cringy for one specific reason, and because the way that it's framed here with Shelley's that it says, you have to tell my story because she was a African queen. Again, Netflix is stressing that, where we're turning right back into the issues of episode 1, where how they're framing her as a African queen and everything that they're doing to depict her, where there is no proof of, and every other form of proof shows the exact opposite. And that's a fact that has been buried, it says. It's been erased, it's been whitewashed. They're saying that Cleopatra has been whitewashed. I wanted to move on from the whole issues of depictions and how they were talking about, like in the first episode, where it says, I don't care what they tell you, Cleopatra was black. And so they're linking the very end to the very beginning, and I had appreciated what they had done moving on into the third episode, where it kind of moves away from things. And the fourth episode doesn't do as good of a job as the third episode, but it simultaneously does do a kind of decent job for the most part. But then it gets to the end here, and it just tackles right back into this whole really cringy bad thing that Netflix is pushing. And that's really it. It goes on to tell how the story of Cleopatra is something that mesmerizes women to this day, and that hers is a story that is always going to be told because it resonates with women everywhere. Which is true. It is. Cleopatra is one of the most common popular stories that is a great depiction of a powerful queen in history. It really is. But in the end, the story that Netflix has done is more close to a docudrama than anything else. And specifically from the beginning has been pushing depictions and sayings and things from Cleopatra of which either there is no proof of or is outright false. I think the thing that I disliked most about this entire series is the sheer amount of melodrama that is put into the reenactment scenes that are not well acted scenes in the first place. Particularly when it comes to battle or drama or flair, there's way too many moments that are put into this series that are just these powerful girl boss comeback moments, where it's things like where it was Cicero at the party that was mocking her, and she uses her wit to talk him down. That wasn't actually very witty or insightful or anything like that. Like, there wasn't anything good. The battle scenes were absolutely terrible. The depictions that it has of Cleopatra actively going and seducing and trying to pursue these men and then turning around at the same time and saying, oh, they're framing her as a great seductress. The series itself almost appears to be schizophrenic as it contradicts itself so many times. In the end, this was not a good series. It just wasn't. There are elements from it that I'm sure people are going to enjoy, and there were a number of elements that even I myself find myself chuckling along with. But overall, the series itself is just not a good production. It's really not. But that is the end of today's episode. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. This has been Sakuya with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching, and let me know what it is that we should do next. If there's other series, other things that you would want me to break down and analyze and talk to you all about, I certainly can. I really do enjoy making content for you guys, and I really appreciate your support in all of this. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. I will see you next time. Goodbye.